Hello. Oh, I forgot to change the cameras. There we go. Hello. There's always one minor fuck up. Let's hope that's the only one for the night, though. You're not bearded heretic either. There you go. There's the second fuck up for the night.
We got to get them out of the way at the beginning. Because let's face it, they're coming back mid-show too.
Yeah. I'm just going to change that. So, yeah, tonight we are doing a show. Funnily enough, funny that we're doing a show.
Right.
And we are doing our show on what's that? I've forgotten his name. The Empathetic Atheist. That's it. So this isn't actually a gentleman that I've ever interacted with myself. Now, I don't know if you all have that friend who, you know, hasn't seen all the big movies. They haven't seen Indiana Jones. They haven't seen Star Wars. They haven't seen Lord of the Rings or anything like that. With internet stuff, that's me. Unless someone's actually put that thing in front of me, I don't actually know much about them. But the reason we are addressing this guy tonight is because he's recently converted to Islam. And I actually think that that's not necessarily that I agree with him, but I think that it's great that we can show that actually there's some of us who do consider all these arguments and things like that and can change our mind. It's really positive, especially when in the community that we're in, we have a load of people that say evidence will change my mind, and then you present them evidence for anything. For example, there's more than one definition of atheism, or, you know, the burden of proof isn't as simple as they think it is, and they outright reject it. So I think it's great that someone has listened to someone else and accepted the arguments. But tonight we're going to be addressing some of the arguments that convinced him, and we're also going to be addressing some of the fallout from the atheist community itself, which, let's face it, some of it has been quite negative. There have been a lot of negative results, haven't there, Dave?
Yeah. People saying he's done it just for money, or he was never really a proper skeptic to begin with, all that kind of
no
stuff.
true Scotsman. Great.
Yeah.
I hate the idea that skepticism can't lead you to theism. I think it can. Skepticism is more than just doubt, and I think that there are some very skeptical and rational theists. I don't agree with them. I don't agree with their end result, their theism, their belief in whatever God that they believe in, but they can be very skeptical and rational people. And we atheists like to say that we're you know, the smart, rational and skeptical ones. And the fact that they've pulled out a no true Scotsman is no different to when a Christian turns round, and if a Christian becomes an atheist or converts to another religion, they go, oh, they never were a true Christian anyway. And that's absolutely ridiculous. You're not inside their head. You don't know. You don't know what they believed. The fact that someone can change their beliefs is a positive thing. And I hope one day the guy sees a bit more reason. Now, we were going to be joined by a couple of folks from Discord tonight. So if you guys want to jump into the SciPhi channel, feel free. It is open. You're more than welcome to. However, if stuff has come up and you're busy, no worries either. It's not a big problem. But Dave, did you want to take away some of the points that you wanted to cover off first?
Well, I was thinking what we could do is probably go over, it's been a long time since I've reconstructed the argument, but we could reconstruct the argument that convinced him, and have a look at it and see what we think of it. See, one of the problems is I don't know the exact argument, because the video I watched was a small part of a larger conversation. Not only of that video was a part of a longer video, but the discussion had been going on for a couple of months, not only on YouTube, but on private servers and in private chats. But I know roughly what the argument was, because it's kind of a standard Muslim apologetic argument.
Right.
Hello, everyone.
Hello,
Hello,
Phil.
Philip.
You all right, dude?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you, Dave?
I'm
After
good,
the
thanks. Yeah,
Okay,
it's
that's good to hear.
I had a couple of mild side effects this afternoon, had a nap, and I seem to be better now.
Okay, great. I mean, as long as you're fine now, I'm happy to hear that.
Nice one, and thank you for thinking of me.
Yeah. You swap
Yeah, no
round.
worries.
You gotta love this.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Let's do that. Right, sorry, just updating the names. If more people join, I'll just switch to the same screen that we use for the end of month. Free for all.
Let's hope that let's hope that your computer can handle it.
Yeah, well, I found a number of things that was going on there. It was a dying USB port. It was my C drive filling up and using all the temp space. And the fact that it's just an old machine dying. But yeah, let's hope.
Let's hope.
Yes, Leon, Philip did a face reveal. It was a complete surprise. I wasn't.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, I mean, I'm still a bit uncomfortable with that, but I have to get used to it at some point. So
Yeah.
might as well.
We're the best people to do it with because we just don't care.
Yeah.
And if it does feel too much, just don't worry about switching your camera off. If if it gets too much for your anxiety and stuff.
Yeah, no, it's no worries. It's fine.
So, hi LB, nice to see you join in, and yeah, Leon, and who was it in the chat earlier? I need to switch back to my other screens so that I can see what's going on.
I feel like that's Ben.
Ben, which Ben?
Ben,
Ben James.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for saying your name, although that's not your actual last name, so I won't say your actual last name. Yeah. All right. And okay. Three Rusty Nails was with us as well, and obviously we've got Leon, and anyone else who's joining in that hasn't said hello in the chat yet. Hello to you as well. So, as we were saying, you know this argument has gone on for quite a few months. Some of it has been recorded live. Some of it has been in private groups, private conversations, and things like that. But you understand what the argument was. You don't know necessarily every single piece of the information, but from what you do know, it's all quite standard rhetoric for a Muslim conversion.
Yeah, sort of. It generally begins with the ex nihilo nil fit argument, moves on to sort of first cause, can't be an infinite regress, essential, no, wrong word, necessary being. And from that necessary being, we can confirm that it's got a mind, and it used that mind to create the universe. And then once you've accepted them, it sort of moves on to why Islam is the proper religion.
Right.
Yeah, from what I've seen, it's sort of like
and the contingency argument.
Yeah, it's a contingency. Like they presented two arguments, like a contingency argument and a cosmological argument, and they sort of do the two stages thing, but where the first stage is just there's something necessary, or there is a cause, and then they have like the second stage, which is the video that we have seen. At least that's the video that was posted, where they try to convince the person that the necessary thing has to be a deity or has to have these properties.
Yeah, it has to have intentions and a mind to choose to create and what to choose to create and that kind of stuff.
So do you wanna break down some of these arguments and we discuss them on stream?
Well, generally the first step would be to get them to accept the something from nothing argument. I'm not sure if that's exactly what was used, but that's commonly what I come across used to come across when I was discussing with Muslims. And it's, of course, the ex nihilo nihil fit argument, and that's something nothing can only produce nothing, or something cannot come from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to get them to accept that first stage in order to show that there must be a cause.
And I suppose from that perspective, do they define what they mean by nothing?
Usually it's the philosophical nothing.
So like the
an
absolute
absence of everything.
Yeah, right. Rather than, the nothing that is generally spoken about in science, which is the vacuum of space, which isn't a complete absence of everything because there's still that vacuum of space there.
Yeah, it's using a slightly different definition of nothing. And of course, it is true that you cannot get something from absolutely nothing. I mean, it's pretty much impossible. If absolutely nothing exists, then absolutely nothing can come from it.
Yeah, no,
Seems
that's
like a valid argument to me.
Yeah, but of course you have to then get them to accept that there was absolutely nothing in the first place.
Yeah, which is one of the ways you could sort of reject the argument. Well, I believe that there was never a time when there was absolutely nothing, and I'm more in line with something like Lawrence Krauss, where there was just an infinite amount of empty space, but empty space is never empty, sort of thing.
Yeah. And then you go along the lines of the virtual particle argument and all of that sort of things.
Yeah. But if you think about it, the theist also does not believe that there was absolutely nothing.
Yep.
Because they believe that God exists.
Yep.
Okay.
So and I think this is one of the things... Sorry, I was just going to say, this is one of the things that I find interesting about that conversation. I mean, generally I have that conversation with Christians rather than with Muslims. But they're willing to accept that there can be an eternal God, but they're not willing to accept that perhaps something in the universe, whether it was empty space or dense energy or anything like that, could have also been eternal. Which I find is a form of special pleading. If they want us to accept that God can be eternal, why can't they accept that there could be some form of something, even if that something is completely empty space?
Yes and no. See, the thing about God existing, them saying, well, I don't believe nothing existed, I believe, if you use the argument, well, I don't believe nothing existed, and they say, well, neither do I believe God. If you posit that there was a physical thing, then you sort of posit that there was a kind of eternal past. Whereas God is argued to be out of time, so therefore not necessarily bound by a chain of eternal causes.
Could you, along the lines of that, though, until whatever caused the Big Bang, there wasn't really time because there wasn't the current laws of physics, so we don't really have time before time, and we don't even know if there was a time before time. So in that regard, it was out of time before the Big Bang as well. Time doesn't make sense before the Big Bang unless we can think of it. I mean, there are different theories on it. There are some people that still ascribe to the infinite number of bangs and crunches over the millennia, aren't there? I think generally that one is discounted now by most people, but there are some that would posit that as an answer. The truth is we don't know. And I think that is as fair as we can say. None of us know. We've got loads of different hypotheses about what it could be, but we don't know.
Yeah. What's your opinion, Philip?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think there is something to be said about the fact that even sort of theists believe, like, they break the usual intuitions on how, for example, causality works. Like, when you say that, something can come from nothing and stuff like that, that's true. But theist believes in creatio ex nihilo, essentially, still, because they believe that the universe didn't have a material cause, right? Like, usually, if you think about causes in the Aristotelian sense, efficient cause, material cause, and stuff like that, then like they believe that the universe had an efficient cause in form of God, but they don't believe that it had a material cause, obviously, because they say, well, everything that is material is in the universe, so whatever creates the universe as the entirety of this has to be non-material. That's the way they like to argue. And I think this is sort of a way that can cast doubt, for example, when we talk about the first premise of the Kalam, for example. It is supported in various ways by Craig, for example, but one of the ways is like inductive reasoning. And he just says that there is a lot of like inductive support for the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and he would be right about that. At the same time, like there's equally as much support for the idea that everything that begins to exist has like a material cause as well, or a material and efficient cause as well, for example. So you can have the same strength of at least the inductive part of the justification for that premise as well, if you wanted to. But of course, that premise doesn't work for the Kalam, for example, because then you would have to admit that sort of that has to have a material cause as well. But that's of course not something that you want to do. And now Craig sort of understands this, and he's sort of like, yeah, I understand that that's the case, but I have to sort of pick what is the likeliest of these scenarios, either with no efficient cause at all, or with just an efficient cause, or with neither of them. But of course, I think there's another option, which is just to be less certain about the first premise of the Kalam. Like if you see that you can justify it by the same means, like at least when it comes to the inductive part of the justification, if you can justify another premise by the same means with the same strength, I think then you might, you might want to reconsider how strong that first premise really is. At least that's my take on it. Like this is specifically for the Kalam now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Kalam front with the first premise there, there's a few problems with it as well, because it speaks of everything that begins has a cause, but there are things that currently, as far as we know, don't have a cause, like virtual particles, and also it's talking about within the universe, so we don't necessarily know if the universe would be subject to the same rules as everything within the universe anyway. So even if it was then one day shown that virtual particles do have a cause, it doesn't necessarily mean that the universe had to have a cause. It's talking about things within the universe and what we know about. And obviously, as you say, it's an argument from induction, and there's nothing wrong with an argument from induction, but it's not wholly strong in itself. Ben has also made a comment. He says, I'm happy to argue for an eternal past for the cosmos, not this specific local universe. I conceive of time and space both being conditions of iterations of universes and the cosmos as a whole.
Yeah, I mean that's one way to argue for it, and we should probably say what the Kalam actually is. So it would be everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And like Philip was saying, there's a strong inductive reasoning for that, but you could also argue, as Russell did, that it's a fallacy of composition. It's saying everything within the universe itself is composed of these causes, physical or efficient, but then you're applying that to the universe as a whole, and we don't necessarily know that what exists as we exist in this thing we call the universe is the universe as a whole.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
sort of like Ben was saying.
Kalam,
Sorry.
I think there's like no. I didn't want to interrupt you. There's like, of course, the second premise as well, which has some objections against it raised. For instance, like many people like to argue against an infinite past. Of course, that seems like the obvious thing, that you cannot have an infinite regress of causes. That's why like Alexander Proust, for example, has like a whole book on causal finitism, which is based on sort of a solution to certain paradoxes that you can get. But it's like causal finitism is not the only solution to these paradoxes. There are other solutions. And so like it is like, I would say it's not unreasonable to think that causal finitism is like a good answer to these paradoxes, but it's not the only available thing. And like there are good reasons to, for example, go with like the unsatisfiable pair hypothesis as well, if you want to solve these paradoxes and stuff like that. So that's and as Joe actually also said, I personally find it interesting when it comes to like talking about an eternal beginning state. It depends on how you define timelessness, because many people define it like by looking at what comes next and what came before. sort of like if you imagine a frame, something is timeless only if there is no frame before it and no frame after it, because otherwise everything could be considered timeless, or at least the first print, like the first frame of everything could be considered timeless because it hasn't experienced time yet. So you could say, for example, that the natural whatever that hasn't experienced time yet is timeless until it changes for the first time, and so then it sort of kicks off the whole temporal chain. So that is another thing to consider as well, I think.
Yeah, that's usually the next stage of the argument as well, isn't it? To argue for the fact that there cannot be an infinite regress of sort of events.
And there's like Hilbert's Hotel and all these sort of things that you can get into with
the firing soldier.
Yeah, exactly all of that. So
yeah.
But I think it's useful maybe to talk about, like, sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No. I thought you had finished what you were saying, so I was going to read a couple of comments out from the chat, but feel free to continue. I can get to them in a moment.
No, just like it might be useful to at some point talk about the contingency argument as well, because there's this sort of cosmological way, and I think they emphasized a lot like this idea that the contingency argument doesn't even require you to accept that an infinite regress is impossible. So they sort of managed to put that into, like, the idea was that presented as well. That's also an interesting thing in my opinion. So we might want to
it's one of the stronger arguments as well, especially as
Rasmussen
presents it.
Yeah, Rasmussen has a very good take on it in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's, that would be the next stage of what they used when arguing with the empathetic atheist. But if you want to read out the comments first, we'll move on.
Yeah, that might be a better thing.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So Rusty says, so if the universe doesn't follow some laws of the physics or whatever, does that count at A equals A? No, because the universe is a different set to everything in the universe. We just froze there. Yeah. Sorry, what were you saying there, dude?
You could also argue something like every set must contain itself to be part of the set, sort of like every barber who shaves, someone who doesn't shave themselves must also be part of that set to but that barber shaves himself, so he can't be part of the set.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah. Does that answer what you're going for there, Rusty? I hope so. I hope this cutting out thing, if it starts happening regularly, isn't what happened the other day, and I've now got another port dying. It'd be just typical, wouldn't it? I do apologise if it happens again, but this is how it started last time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Let me turn that off, just in case it's trying to jump. So what I did notice the other day, and I actually upgraded all my drivers and stuff, was it kept on cutting out of the USB port and the sound started coming through my screen as well. So I think, well, hopefully it's not my sound card that's dying, and so it looks like it's happening again. How bloody annoying. So yeah, this is a case of my sound card keeps thinking that it's dying, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, because there's not much I can do. It's not even my processor or RAM or anything being overcharged at the moment. CPU's only at 44%. You know, it is literally either the motherboard USB ports dying, or it is the sound card dying. Great. Anyway, so the other comment that we had was from Ben, and Ben said, I'm with Alex Malpass when he rejects the a priori rejection of infinite regress arguments. I get that it's intuitive it's moving anthropocentric basis for such acknowledged, but so are countless falsehoods.
Yeah, and you see, this is why, like Hamza Sortsis, he used to go with the infinite regress argument a lot. So his example was usually the soldier waiting for orders. but it's become quite popular among Muslim apologists now to swap that out for the contingency argument, because that sort of avoids the infinite regress and just going, well, I accept an infinite regress. With the contingency argument, it's slightly more complicated, but also slightly more intuitive, wouldn't you say, Philip?
Yeah, I think like I'm not going to pretend that I know a lot of good. Like I haven't read a lot on it yet, so I'm not exactly sure how I would reply. I have certain things from Oppie on the contingency argument that I find interesting, but it's definitely like a more straightforward approach than like a cosmological argument, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, so the contingency argument is something like this. I'll try and break it down into something really simple. It's quite a complicated argument, but I'll try and make it simple. So there are things in the universe that could or could not exist. They are sort of contingent on some aspect that happened before it, or some cause that happened before it. Now, if we go back and back and back, we find, so say, imagine you being born. That's contingent on your parents existing and having sex at just the right time. And then they're contingent on their parents, and their parents, and their parents, and their parents, until you get back to a certain point where all those events are necessary for you to come into being. And the same could be said of the universe, where there are things, the universe may or may not have existed. Does that make sense? And the universe and everything inside it are contingent. And as long as we keep going back and back and back, we will come to a point where there is some necessary foundation that begins all of those contingencies. And if you argue that, say, the necessary being is contingent on something, well, then you've just not got to the necessary being yet, because that thing you're calling the necessary being is contingent upon something before it. Does that sound like a reasonable simplification?
Yeah, that I think is the interesting part about this. I think is that they sort of argue that it could go at infinite, like it could be an infinite regress, but there's still sort of a set of contingent things, even if it's infinite, and so it has to have like some sort of a non-contingent thing, because otherwise it's just contingent. So the entire set has to have something that is necessary in this case outside of it.
Think of like a big long row of dominoes. In order for those dominoes to be, each domino is sort of depending on the domino before it to knock it down.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just keep going back and back and back and back, there is nothing that can actually set those dominoes in motion if it's just infinite. So at some point, you will eventually get to a point where somebody tips the first domino. And that's basically, the contingency. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically the contingency argument. And that's one of the things that convinced the empathetic atheist that there must be some kind of necessary being in order to kick everything off.
And what do you think about that one?
It's quite a powerful argument.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what can you really say to it? You could argue that there is some sort of brute fact about the universe that is necessary, and the universe could be physical, and there are just brute facts that exist within the universe that kick everything off.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems more intuitive to think of it in terms of efficient causes.
Hmm.
And that's one of, especially if you look at Joshua Rasmussen's sort of version. Because you can argue, well, brute facts, maybe God is just a brute fact.
Yeah. But again, we're back to sort of a bit of a I don't know. So there is obviously some brute fact, and some people say, well, that's God, and some people will say, well, it's something else.
Yeah, so that would be why they sort of argue in two stages. One stage is to convince you that there is sort of a necessary thing, and then they will sort of try to argue that this necessary thing must have these properties. I think a good way to approach it is this idea that like if you have like the event that it is the sum of all contingent events, at least this is an idea that I'm like straight up stealing from OPI. At least this is where I got it from. Like if you have a sum of every contingent events, of all contingent events, and then you have a necessary thing that caused this sum of all contingent events. So, and the necessary event is necessary. Then the causal relationship between the necessary thing and the sum of all contingent events is either itself necessary or contingent. Now, if it is contingent, then you have like the summation of all contingent things that doesn't contain this thing, and so the argument fails, because you have to sort of posit that the grouping of all contingent things includes all contingent things, but you just posited like this relationship, this causing from the necessary thing to the grouping of all contingent things that is itself contingent, so it's not contained within the set, so that's a problem for your argument. And if it's necessary, it's even more of a problem, because then you cannot have something contingent that is like coming from a necessary thing that is also like necessarily connected by a causal relationship to it. So it cannot be necessary. So there would be sort of like a reductio of this idea in a way, that you can't have either one of these.
Yeah. And I mean, you can actually sort of make an argument for a being that is both necessary and contingent. I know it sounds kind of weird, but imagine a guy who believes he exists. Now, he is necessary for that belief that he exists, because if he doesn't exist, he can't believe that he exists. So once he dies, he can no longer believe he exists. So for that belief and that causal relation for the belief, he must necessarily exist. But there could be a time before that he didn't. He just comes into being. He is necessary for that belief, but he is a contingent being.
Yes.
Just to complicate the argument a little bit.
Yeah, that's it.
So I don't know if you saw my face then, but my brain was visibly twisting inside, going, "Huh?"
That's what I'm here for. I think that might actually be somebody like Sol Kripke that presented some, like his is a much more refined version of mine, obviously, because he's a much better philosopher. But that's the sum of the idea that he presents.
So Ben asks a two-part question. First bit is, within the contingency argument, isn't there the founding assumption that there needs to be an original thing to set off, thus begging the question for finitude, the conclusion?
It's less begging the question and more just showing that there needs to be this thing that exists. Showing that without this necessary thing, it will just continue on forever, and nothing will ever bring about these contingent things. It's just showing that finitude is the thing that we should be accepting, rather than beginning with finitude and arguing from finitude.
There. So the second part was also there's a bit of horseshoe theory applying to brute fact versus necessary being arguments. Both end up in the same place effectively, asserting some necessary baseline, just conceived differently. It was more of a statement than a question. Rusty also says, why is an infinite regress a problem?
Okay. I suppose the soldier one is kind of a good example here. If we imagine we're a soldier on the front line and we're waiting for orders to fire. Now, we have to get that order from the soldier previous to us, because that's what we're told. Now, imagine if the soldier before, he's waiting for the soldier before him, that one's waiting for the soldier before him. Now, imagine there's just an infinite chain of soldiers going on in the past. It will never, ever get to the point where there is a commander telling anybody to fire, so it can never, ever get back to you to actually fire.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they argue that you cannot have an infinite regress, because if there's an infinite infinite amount of causes and time before the actual Big Bang, it will never ever get to the Big Bang.
So Ben actually says further up in the chat, sorry for missing this, Ben, but he says Malpass dealt with the soldier argument directly, showing that it was asking for a two-way causal process backwards, then forwards, through eternal time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So would we argue that that's potentially a bit different to, you know, an infinite regress of universes?
It is, but there's still the point that if it went on forever in the background, what kicked off all the events that got to, you could sort of take out a section of the infinite amount of time. So think of something like eternal rather than infinite both ways. So there is a beginning, but then all you've done is push back the first cause further and further and further. At least that's how a Muslim or Christian might argue it.
Yeah, that's fair. He also asks, what if you only apply contingency to being?
I need a bit more details.
Rusty, if you can get back to us on that one, that's great. Ben also says, RE the contingency argument and begging the question. I meant specifically within the rejection of the possibility of an infinite regress as a defense of the arguments to establish the necessity. That's fair enough, dude. God, you know, I'm having a lot of trouble reading tonight, aren't I? Even more than normal.
It's more complicated than normal.
Yeah. I've had one of those long old days as well. So yeah, do we have anything more we need to cover on that contingency? Did you have any common things that you would find the reasons why you would reject it? Phil?
Yeah, Phil.
So yeah, I think sorry, I didn't get that. So yeah, I would say that there are certain concerns about the contingency argument that apply, like the one I mentioned before. I think that is a problem that you have to deal with in a way or another. I think Malpass in general, like especially in the Kalam, is absolutely fantastic. So that is a very good resource to check out. Other than that, even I think it is important to keep in mind that, like, even if you say that the Kalam succeeds or the contingency argument succeeds, there is like this whole second stage that needs to be operated as well. So I think there are very good responses on both sides, actually, as to why we should think maybe that this has sort of a will, but there are also, I think, excellent reasons why you should sort of reject that. And I think, as some philosophers point out as well, if you really think that this sort of chain of reasoning is airtight and that it leads just like to a all good, all knowing, and all sorts of like omni attributes being, then at some point you can also sort of present arguments for atheism, like for example hiddenness and evil, in order to sort of cast doubt on this entire chain of reasoning. Because if you think that this reasoning must necessarily lead there, then you have a bunch of other arguments that sort of count against that hypothesis. Then you can sort of either try to defeat these arguments, or you have good reasons in those arguments to sort of question the entire integrity of this chain of reasoning, because they give you good reason to think that maybe this is not as airtight as it might seem. So that is another way that you could look at it, at all of this, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the ways that Oppie sort of attacks it. He says, well, even if we accept all these things, there's still all these other things that you have not been able to, kind of counter. And these kind of show that the argument isn't quite as convincing. I mean, even if you accept the contingency argument, say, well, yeah, there is this necessary being. Maybe it's just natural. I mean, we only have evidence of physical causes causing physical events. So maybe it's just a chain of physical events that go back to, say, a multiverse or something like that. I just don't have enough information to be able to say what it was. And then you let them move on to the second part and you start attacking the second part. See, one of the things about arguments like this is when they come in multi-parts, you can accept certain steps and just wait until you find the step that you feel that you can attack.
Mm.
Yeah, I think Oppie is generally famous for this approach. Like he will just accept that there needs to be a necessary thing, and then he'll argue for a naturalistic necessary thing, and that's his usual approach. And then he'll compare theories like the theistic model versus the naturalistic model, and he'll make sort of like inference based on not even inferences, but just the observations on the like quality of the theories, like explanatory power, like how simple it is, how many unnecessary things it posits, how much it costs in terms of like commitments and all of that sort of thing. So that is another approach that you can take. I think it's a very good approach and very interesting approach.
Yeah,
as well.
it definitely is. Oppie is one of the best. I mean, if
Definitely.
people want to worry
Yes.
about things like this, I mean, a lot of atheists will just say, well, that's not evidence. But when you approach it like that, you will get people who will end up being convinced by this. So it's best not to just say, well, just deny everything, just deny evidence, because there will be people convinced by arguments. We often are convinced by arguments. Even if part of our base is, well, I need physical evidence, there is still rhetoric power in arguments, and they can convince somebody. So even if you believe this, there must be physical evidence, something might click from an argument. So unless you have the arguments to counter those or look at those in a different way, you may still end up being convinced just by argument or argumentative power.
And what you're saying there about the rhetorical side, I think people are actually more inclined to be convinced by someone that they have a good rapport with, they've built up a good conversation, they're having a polite conversation, they're showing respect to each other, and they're just having a chat about these things, than they actually are by physical evidence. It's actually been shown a number of times that evidence doesn't convince people the way they thought they think it does, even especially if they have a firm belief about something. You know, if they're really uncertain, then maybe evidence will convince them one way, but once they've made up their mind about something and no, this is what I believe to be true, and you know, someone goes, well, here's some evidence, they go, you know, I don't accept that evidence, that's not evidence, that's not strong evidence, so on and so forth. They won't accept it. I mean, there was even the example of that person saying, you know, I think evidence does convince people, and someone turned around and said, well, here's two studies that show that actually it isn't true, and they turned around and go, well, I still think it works.
Yeah.
Like, right. Do you see what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, if you start with a principle that you think must be true and you must argue that principle, you will change the arguments that lead up to it in order to keep hold of that particular principle or conclusion. So it's not necessarily arguments that will change your mind or evidence that will change your mind. It could be a mixture of both. It depends on how fundamental that principle or conclusion is to you as a person.
Yeah, definitely. So a couple more comments before we move on. Scrolling back up. No, we're up to date on that. So Ben's going back to the Kalam here, and he says, I have an argument, re the Kalam, that it's compatible with the big bounce cosmology with an infinite regress of causes, and can be made compatible with a naturalistic perspective by specifying definitions. The cause doesn't need to be singular or theistic. What do you think about that?
It definitely doesn't need to be theistic. And causes can be multiple. I mean, there could be multiple reasons why your bus is late, for example. If we just do efficient causes, there could be multiple reasons why your bus is late. It could be the engine's a little knackered, it's caught up in traffic, it can't get up the hills quite quickly. You know, there are multiple things that can go into a cause. I think generally when people think of cause, they think of something like the efficient cause, where what started the fire? Well, a person lit it. But if you go with something like Hume, you could say, well, that person lighting it wasn't the cause. It was the flame sparking up and touching the thing. But then you could go deeper and say, well, it's the heat exciting the atoms, and you can always go deeper into those causes.
Mm.
And there's multiple chains for just one efficient cause.
Yeah, definitely.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. Don't have anything to say on it, so it clearly did. Rusty goes, going back to infinite regress. So what? What if it does exist? It doesn't take away the event of our existence or the event of the universe. Is infinite regress a possibility?
You want to have?
Yeah. Sorry.
If you lean forward, so I thought.
No. I generally want to wait to see what is. No, I think definitely you could say that it is a possibility. Like, there is no logical contradiction by accepting an infinite regress. That doesn't happen. In fact, that most pop apologists, if they say that, you could just ask, where's the contradiction, and they won't be able to tell you. Like, you have to sort of construct these scenarios that lead to contradictions. And once you have these scenarios in place, then there are multiple solutions to these contradictions. And one of them is saying, well, an actual infinite is impossible, and that's what the apologists usually like to do, and Christian philosophers. But there are other solutions. Like, I think, again, Malpass is an excellent resource on this, and sort of the unsatisfiable pair hypothesis is another way to solve these issues. So you can definitely solve them in other ways. It could be that there is an infinite regress, but I also don't think you're sort of irrational for thinking that it is not possible that an actual infinite exists. And I think that is sort of, that triggers me a bit from like atheists who are just oh yeah, this is so irrational, right? Because you can prove this thing. And I mean, sure, you can prove this, but it's not like it's unreasonable to think that an actual infinite is not possible. I think, at least.
Well, I mean, I can think of one infinite that it's a metaphysical thing, which is numbers. I mean, they just keep going that way and that way. So technically, that is some form of infinity, isn't it? So if there's one, that surely means that there's a possibility of another. It's a bit different when you're going back into an infinite regress, of course, but if we can show that infinity itself is a possibility, at least within metaphysics, then surely that means that there could be others, like a possibility.
Well, that's it. I mean, you can argue that maybe infinity is some sort of metaphysical thing, and metaphysically possible, even when speaking about the universe, but it might not actually be physically possible. So if they argue that, say, the universe can't be infinite, well, yeah, okay, fine. But there's also no thing that says, like Philip says, there's also no logical contradiction to say, well, yeah, it just goes on forever in the back. I might not understand how, but there's no logical contradiction. There's just something very intuitive about it, because our experiences show that something usually has something that sets off a chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, even if we think about the rain.
Yeah.
I think there's also a distinction between like an actual infinite, like this is the thing that they like to talk about, that there's sort of a potential infinite, and I think most people would accept, even William Lane Craig would accept that. In fact, he argues for a future infinite sort of, he says that, the future can continue on for infinitely because it's sort of a limit, right? It's just by addition, it tends to infinity, but it never really is an actual infinite. So that's sort of like how that would work, I think. But again, if we talk about Malpass again, he has an entire paper on sort of mirroring of the tenses. So he says that if you can't have an actual infinite in the past, then you shouldn't be able to have an actual infinite in the future. So the future has to come to an end at some point, even if it tends to this infinite. And that's sort of like there has been a debate about this as well. Which, of course, like William Lane Craig wouldn't want to accept that the future must come to an end. He would like to say, oh, no, it can't actually go on forever. But then there's sort of problems with that, and mirroring across that. And so, yeah, it's an interesting discussion for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to look at the contingency argument as well, I think Rasmussen he's got books on it, but he's got a paper on it as well that's kind of a short paper. And I think it is just called the contingency arguments or something like that. And he argues for both for and against, like any good philosopher would do. He also shows the problems with his own argument. So there is counters to the contingency argument within Joshua Rasmussen's paper when he's arguing for. He doesn't accept them, but there are some very strong counters to it in his paper itself.
Fair play to him. Ben says, I think that skeptics have an upper hand here in that simply posing the possibility of infinite regress is easy to justify, or easier to justify, maybe is what you meant to say, than to claim the impossibility of the infinite regress by the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. How would you show that an infinite regress is impossible beyond these conceptual ideas that a chain of events must have something to set off that chain of events? You can't show it's impossible. You can show it's unlikely, but not impossible.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right there, Ben. Is there anything else that you needed to add or wanted to add about the contingency argument, or should we move on to the next one?
We can move on to the next one.
Yeah?
I mean, we spent quite a while on the contingency argument already, so... Yeah.
Yeah, sorry if we bored you.
So, with this argument style and with the argument with the empathetic atheist, they convinced him using the contingency argument that there must be a necessary being. So with that comes a second part to the argument, and that is to argue that it's not just being in the sense of, say, a grounding, it's being in the sense of it having a mind and intentions and things like that. Oh, wait, well, he jumps out the window because I bored him.
Sorry, it's really hot in here. I just had to open the window. I thought you were going to be
overheating your brain.
Yeah, I thought you were going to keep talking, so I thought, right, whilst he's going, I've got the headphones on, I can hear what he's saying. Typically, I turned the mic off so that I wouldn't make any noise whilst clomping around, so I couldn't even respond to you from across the room. So they convinced him that this being is a being, essentially.
Yeah.
And they turned that being into their being.
Yeah.
They didn't do that yet, I think. I mean, at least not on the video. Like there must have been some other conversation.
There was conversation outside.
Yeah, probably. But they like, from what we know, at least from the video, they just sort of not even convinced him of theism, because at the end of the video, at least the one I saw, he wasn't sure about it. He was very close, but he didn't yet, say, okay, now I'm a theist or something like that. So he must have done that I don't know, a day or so later, I imagine.
Well, sometimes these ideas take a while to digest and they go round and round in your mind. So he's obviously, like any of us would, in that sort of conversation, you have your position. Someone might make a good argument, but at that moment in time, it doesn't necessarily convince you. You might go away and think on it, and then you might come back and go, you said this. What about? And this is probably the conversations he had offline. He's asked a few questions and they've managed to give convincing answers. So in some respects, it's a shame that we're not privy to that part, the in-between bits, the questions he then asked that then got turned around. So we don't know the whole story. We've just got the big ticket items in between, don't we?
Well, I'm guessing he's now going by Sahil Allah.
Yeah.
He must have taken the Shahada. Yeah.
Before we move on, sorry, Rusty's got one more question about the contingency. He says, I have one more contingent question. Sorry. if God has a gender, wouldn't that make him or her contingent?
Yeah, that's the thing, though. God doesn't have a gender as usually defined. It's just that he's usually described as he, rather than actually him being a he, if that makes sense.
Because we're patriarchal bastards.
Yeah, something along those lines.
But yeah. So yes, where were we? Oh, you zoomed in there, Phil. What happened?
I'm sorry. What?
That was funny. You just suddenly zoomed in.
Oh, that's supposed to happen.
Made me jump. It might have just been a little bit of video lag, and it just made me go. Oh. So anyway, you were saying.
Okay, so now we've got to the necessary being, and we've accepted that, like, not us, but the argument is we've accepted that there is something that needs to ground all of the events. Now, in order for those events to get started, we would imagine that there needs to be something to make a choice to get those events started. They could be random, or they could be a choice. And it seems more likely that a necessary grounding that is doing nothing, there would be some choice involved in it coming about. For there to be a choice involved in it coming about, there must be a mind behind it. And if we think about it, the universe is a particular way. It could, according to the contingency argument, the universe could not have existed. But it does, and it exists in a particular way. And if you think about something like the fine-tuning argument, the things are tailored for specific events to come about, for humans to come about. And if we think about gravity being slightly different, the arguments that if gravity was slightly different, the universe would have fizzled out. If there was an imbalance in matter and antimatter, it would have fizzled out. So there must have been a choice for it to be a specific way in order to come about a specific way.
Yeah, another way to think about it is, I think, at least many theists like to argue this way, is well, if the first state is sort of like doesn't have the conditions to bring about change and therefore time, then it will never do so, because it doesn't change, because it's timeless, right? But we see a universe, so there had to be something that sort of brought it about. And if this is necessarily so, then the entire universe is necessarily so, because if the first thing had to be the way it is, then sort of you have time as a necessity of that, because it couldn't have been otherwise. And so since the universe, they say, is contingent, so it could have existed or could have not existed, there has to be something that can sort of switch between these two things, right? It can be completely necessary, yet do not bring necessarily about the changes. And so that is best explained with a mind that sort of chooses to bring it about. At least that's how I understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going, I think there's a lot of problems with things like the fine-tuning argument. But I feel if we start addressing those, I'm probably we're going to go a bit off piece. We can spend ages. Yeah, definitely. But yeah.
So that's basically the argument that appears to have convinced him in the video, that there needs to be a mind with intentions that creates the universe. So therefore, there is some kind of being that exists that brought about the universe. And of course, you could add on all the arguments for why it's spaceless, timeless, all those kind of things. But that's essentially the arguments that were visible in the shorter video.
Did the video address the bits that convinced him about Islam, though?
No. But I
No.
know what those arguments are generally.
We're going to address them on the stream as well.
Yeah, if you like. Okay, the
I have
argument
no idea
for
about.
well, the argument for that is it goes something like this. So you have this being that's chosen to create the universe, and he's chosen to bring about humans in order to have a relationship with himself. And if you think about, say, imagine you get a dog, you want it trained. And so God, when he brought about the universe, he brought about it with rules about how he would like the universe to be.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for the universe to be like he wants it to be, he brings about explanations and guidance for how we should live our lives, because the universe is also a test. So if we think of the universe as a test, it would be an unfair test if he just sat us down, left us to it, and at the end he said, well, you failed my test. So as God is a fair being, he brings about instructions, and he uses divine revelation to bring about those instructions. And it began with, say, Moses, and it followed on. And because the Jews corrupted the Torah, he brought about Christianity in order to update things and just reaffirm his rules. Now, according to the Quran, Christianity got corrupted as well because it was an attempt at using power. And they lied about Jesus being crucified and being resurrected. And they changed the story in order to suit them and give themselves more power. So eventually, Allah brought about a final revelation, which is the Quran. And there's arguments for why the Quran is perfectly preserved, why he chose Muhammad because he's perfect. So with all those corruptions, he brought it to the Arabs who he knew would protect his final revelation. And that's what shows that the Quran is the final revelation, along with the miracle of the Quran itself.
How do they address religions that have popped up after that then?
They're all fake. Because the Quran is the final revelation. It's a good way of inoculating it against any further attacks on it. I mean, the Bible sort of does it. With there's a verse like, "Don't trust a wolf in sheep's clothing. Anything that comes after Jesus is a lie because Jesus is the Son of God," and that kind of stuff.
I know. I mean, obviously, we addressed your article a little while ago about the Quran being perfect, and shown that from one aspect at least it definitely wasn't. But there are plenty of other aspects that we can address that it's not. So, did they address any of that sort of thing with it as well?
What, with the empathetic atheist?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, because that wasn't included in any of the videos.
Right. And are there any decent rebuttals to the fact that the Quran isn't actually perfect? I mean, good ones, not you just don't understand it, right? Those ones are pathetic. But are there any actually good ones that you've heard?
Well, it depends. See, the perfection isn't the only argument that they use to convince you that it is a revelation from God. And I'm sure you're familiar with Hamza Sortzis' scientific miracles in the Quran. He no longer uses that, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, he did a bit
But there are
U-turn on that, didn't he?
Yeah, and that's because he kept getting defeated at it, and there is no way to absolutely prove those. But a lot of Muslims still use that, like Zakir Naik.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the scientific miracles. And in fact, we addressed a couple of those in the stream about it as well. Like the water meeting, like the two different densities of water meeting, and so they look like two different seas. And And they're like, how would they know? But obviously the answer to that, a simple answer, is the fact that they were traders. So they would have had people come from the sea, and they would have maybe told them about that sort of thing. And you can actually explain a lot of the miracles through rational means, and some of them aren't even that miraculous anyway.
No, and some of the claims are just plain wrong. Like and some of them are overblown, like the development of the fetus. It's basically 6 lines long, and there's no way that you're going to get a good representation of the science that goes on in reproduction in like 6 lines. It's just impossible.
And also, semen comes from the back, doesn't it?
The backbone.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's stuff in it that's outright wrong. So, I mean, how do they even answer that? I mean, I've heard a couple of excuses in the past, actually, where they talk that no, it's just a metaphor. It's not being specific. It's actually talking about the general area, and the testes develop from there when you're a really young age, and that's how they
drop
out.
Down.
And you hear that sort of argument, you're like, right, I mean, you are really, really stretching it here. Not the nutsack, obviously.
Well, it depends on what they're into.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, there's a book written in, I think it was the late 70s by some doctor, and he actually kind of confirmed some of these miracles, but he was hired by the actual Saudi government to write this book.
Right.
So there could be a slight conflict of interest there.
Yeah.
And in the book, there was a lot of scientists quoted, and they attended a sort of meeting where they discussed these miracles. And a lot of those, if you go on YouTube and you search it out, you'll find a lot of them arguing, well, I was just taken out of context. They stripped down some of the stuff that I said and picked up on very specific words and used that to say I was claiming that the Quran was right.
Yeah, fair. So if they didn't address the perfectness of the Quran, I mean, maybe
there is one more. Hang on.
Okay.
Another one is that Muhammad was illiterate, and how could somebody that was illiterate write such prose and write such a complicated book?
Dictation?
Yeah, that's it. But proving that he was, the Quran is a miracle because no illiterate person could produce a work like the Quran.
Yeah, fair. But obviously, the simple answer there is dictation.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of it was. If you go back through something like Sahih Bukhari, where it's the hadith, you'll see that a lot of it was dictated, and there's bits in Bukhari that talk about going around what was the Arabian Peninsula, collecting bone fragments and leaf fragments and stuff where people had written down what Muhammad said.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it just shows again how simple answers obviously make more sense, and they've got a lot more justification to try and actually say, well, no, it wasn't the simple answer. It was clearly this miraculous thing. But it comes back to sort of Occam's razor, doesn't it? In those sort of situations.
Yeah. The other thing is, I mean, I know there's Westerners becoming convinced of Islam, but most Muslims have been brought up in a Muslim society or Muslim family, and they're taught from the very beginning that these things are miraculous. And it's suddenly, if you've been hearing the same thing for, say, 15 years, 16 years, it's all obviously going to affect how you see rebuttals and sort of criticisms. You're just going to think, well, no, you're just wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's a lot of Muslims that leave Islam as well, just as there's a lot of Westerners that join.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Westerners are joining it, especially from countries like America, where it's sort of so far out the way. and it's generally a heavily Christian nation. Now, I mean, both Christians and Muslims would hate saying this, but it's essentially the same God. It's an extension of the same faith, in the same way that Christianity is Judaism 2.0. We could say that Islam is Christianity 2.0 or Judaism 3.0. They probably all hate comments like that because they don't necessarily want to be attributed to each other. Although, like you mentioned earlier, like the Muslims will say that no, basically, both Judaism and Christianity got corrupted, so that there's some truth in there, but it's not the whole truth, and this is why this is the final revelation, and it will stay uncorrupted, etc. You know, God's put his touch on it. It can't be. It's always going to be perfect. But you know what? I hear the same sort of things from Christians as well, talking about the Bible being perfect. And when I've said, well, why does this translation say this thing and this translation say that thing? You know, you're saying it's perfect and it's protected by God and the meaning won't be lost. But these two lines read completely differently to each other. They have different inferences. So what do you mean it's perfect?
Yeah.
And you could say the same thing about the Quran as well. It was one of the things you brought up about it not being perfect. If you have to read it in the original Arabic and it can't be translated clearly, then clearly it's not perfect. It's not a simple instruction. It's not the best way to live your life. If God's rules can only actually be explained in a language that is taught by a minimal number of people, you know, if you wanted to go to the mass quantities, surely God would have made it translatable and simply too. So again, you've got another issue there, showing the issue with the perfection. So is there another stage that they'd have gone to after that? So you mentioned they probably didn't address the perfection in the Quran, and maybe he wasn't even aware about these arguments. We don't really know. We're not inside his mind. I'd love to have a chat with him about it, actually.
Well, one of the things he said in the stream, and I don't know if it's the same stream that Philip watched, because I've seen a couple of variations of it.
Yeah,
yeah. He said he looked for rebuttals and criticisms of all the arguments that the people were making, but he found nothing that convinced him that these arguments were wrong. So going by his words, he did actually set out to try and disprove them. He just wasn't convinced by the rebuttals.
And another thing that I wanted to mention real quickly, like the people he was talking to strike me as very, very honest interlocutors. Like,
yeah.
I think they're very good at what they're doing. They're very well informed. And like some of them even mentioned, for example, look, you don't have to say anything now, right? And he even mentioned that there are many philosophers who disagree. There's all this work, like he mentioned Oppie many times, for example, one of them, right? They know about this, and like saying, I very much appreciated that he was like sort of pointing out, look, that there are people who disagree, and sort of like you can read about this, and you should read about this. So that is something that I find. Like very honest, very, very productive conversation. I like that a lot. So
yeah, definitely. And that sort of behavior would make you a bit more willing to listen, and
as well. Like, that sort of proves. That proves the point that we are always making, almost, right? That if you listen and if you try to sort of engage openly with these things, you might actually have someone that changes his or her mind. I think that's a very good approach, and they are the demonstration of it. I think they're very cordial. They speak very openly, and they're clearly very, very well informed. And I really like that in general, the conversation style. I really, really appreciated it.
It's one thing I will say for a lot of Muslims who use dawah is that they are philosophically informed. They know the arguments well, and they go about trying to promote them. And if you think about, like Philip was saying, they are very cordial. They're sort of go up, think about this. Here's the rebuttals. Now you think of that compared to, say, a lot of new atheists who aren't very cordial, aren't very accepting. They'll say you're just a fucking idiot for even thinking about these arguments. Which side are you going to prefer speaking to?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, we've said it a number of times these days. Quite often, when we're having conversations on the internet, we tend to prefer having conversations with people that are not atheists. I mean, don't get me wrong, we get to meet people like you from time to time, Phil, and it's great. But in general, like when we have those conversations with a lot of atheists online, we do end up with the equivalent of the fire and brimstone type. You know, and it's awful, absolutely awful the way we see a lot of them behave. And actually, we're probably gonna, I don't know if we're gonna address it just yet, but we're going to talk about some of the online atheist community's behavior in relation to this. Now, was there any more of the arguments that need to be presented, Dave?
No, but I will say one thing. There was a guy that he was discussing it with, the Muslim metaphysician, and he looked exactly like Wilson Fisk from Daredevil.
Really?
Oh my, yeah, that's true. Now that I think about it,
he does, doesn't he? Like, not so much when he turns to the side, but when he's staring straight at the camera, you just think Wilson Fisk.
Yes. Yes.
That's the real truth, isn't it? He was scared to say no to this guy.
He might get his head in the car door. Bang, 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 bang. But no, he did. As soon as I looked at him, I thought, isn't that the actor who plays Wilson Fisk? No, it can't be.
It's interesting.
Not that it's a criticism or anything, but I just found it kind of interesting.
Yeah. So from straight on, he looked exactly like him, sort of same hairstyle as well.
Didn't see the hairstyle because he had a baseball cap on.
Fair.
But he also had similar sort of mannerisms in the way he spoke, and he was quite softly spoken, but confident in the way he spoke and things like that. And he does know his arguments. I will say he knows his arguments.
Yeah, which is good. It's definitely good. And I think actually that's one of the problems that a lot of the online atheist community has with these sorts of discussions. They don't actually have much in their tool belt because they see skepticism purely as doubt, or even worse, just denying things. There's a difference. And they'll just go, no, and they won't look into any of the apologetics or anything like that. And when they finally have a decent conversation with people who are willing to engage respectfully and present these sorts of arguments, they'll suddenly go, oh, wow. Oh, you've blown me away. And you're just like, oh, dear.
Yeah, I think that's similar to what happened with the Empathetic Atheist. Because if you think about somebody like Randolph Richardson, who argues that if you use skepticism, you can see the contradictions in the arguments that are being made. Well, what happens if you use skepticism and you can't see contradictions in the argument being made? Your skepticism is going to kind of fail you. And you're going to start to think, oh, okay, well, maybe what they're saying has some kind of explanatory power to it or some persuasive power.
I mean, if you think that it's automatically rational to reject something just because you reject it, then you're not going to build these tools. You're not going to look into these things. And then, of course, people who want to defend these things are going to build all of this tool sets, philosophical tool set, and they're going to know these things. And then, like, you have people like the empathetic atheist who just then sort of converse with these people and find, oh, they're not like that irrational as I thought. Maybe they have some arguments, and then it leads into this. And it's not a problem, as I said. Like, I totally agree with you that, like, someone can change his mind on this, right? I'm totally fine with that. I think it shows great honesty, and I think he is honest, and he really tries to, like, that's how I perceived him, at least, right? That he wants to find out about the truth, you know, and he became friends with these people. At least that's my impression. They talked daily and something like that, and they convinced him. And that's the problem, because these people know their stuff. And most atheists just, you know, they don't even want to look at it. They just go, no, I am rational because I reject these things. So, like, that's sort of a problem.
And in general, I reckon the average online atheist, the type of theist they'd have spoken to is the fundamentalist theist, who are equally as fire and brimstone as them. So whether they're a Christian or a Muslim, they're all, you know, they're going to be used to the ones that are just telling them that they're going to hell and they should believe, or they're going to hell, and Allah or God is you know, going to give you a bad life, and so on and so forth. And then they meet one that isn't like that. and again, that's I mean, we have it happen to us sometimes when we're talking to theists. They might start off a bit abrasive because, oh, it's another atheist, and we go, oh no, I agree with you on that point, and they're like, what? No,
Yeah.
you're right there. Oh, and then we have a conversation. We've stopped that aggressiveness going on. We have a conversation. Most of the time, we still end up disagreeing at the end of it, but it's not that part that matters. We've had a good conversation. We've built the rapport. And if my goal was to try and convince them of my view, I could continue those conversations and go back day after day. Did you think about what I said? Oh, you did. What did you think of that? Do you have anything? Oh, you think it's right? Okay, that's fair. Have you considered this thing? Ah, okay. Well, let me take you through it, and you tell me what you think about it, and you can go along those things. And that's to me. I mean, these things are a long process. Changing a mind from a, especially if it's a firmly held position, it does take a long time. It's not something as simple as me convincing you that, oh, maybe you should actually go and watch the new Avengers in the cinema, or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm back again. We actually
Okay.
did. We did okay there for a good chunk, and then it just suddenly died again.
Yeah. Yeah, like I was saying, most people aren't convinced by a single point or a single argument. They're convinced over a long time, like you say, by several arguments, by the rhetorical power of the person arguing, by how friendly they are, by the rapport with them. And if we think about beliefs, we don't have one belief. Beliefs aren't things that exist in isolation. Beliefs are an interconnected web of beliefs and ideas. So in order to change one belief, you have to sort of change all the things that lead to that belief and are attached to that belief. And that can only be done by several arguments and by being listened to and things like that. So I agree. It's not as simple as just saying, well, the contingency argument. Why aren't you convinced? It's, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? Now that you've thought about this, what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And that is how the Muslims approached it.
Yeah, there might even be times when you go, once you've accepted this, okay, do you remember that first thing we talked about that you weren't sure on? How does your view on this affect that? And you can end up going back. And it's not even a linear argument always. It's sometimes a lot of going round and round like that.
Loops and
yeah.
I wish I could remember the name of the podcast. I remember the acronym is TAP, but I can't. It's something. It's the something podcast, and I can't remember what it is. Unfortunately,
the something podcast.
Yeah,
it's really specific. Thank you, Dave.
But it begins with an A.
The A something podcast.
Yeah, it might be like the apologetic podcast or something like that.
Fair.
No, I think it's sort of like something with journey, like the adventures in thought.
The
or something
adventure
like,
podcast or something. Yeah.
Yeah, something with like I'm looking it up.
I was just about to.
Well, whilst you two are looking it up, I'll read out Leon's comment.
Thought Adventure podcast.
That's it.
Thought Adventure podcast. Yeah,
excellent, wicked. So is that the same sort of, you talking about those sort of arguments going around, or was that their podcast?
That was their podcast.
Okay, so I mean, if anybody wants to check that out, check out the Thought Adventure podcast. Who knows? It may even change your mind as well. And if you're afraid of having your mind changed, then that says something about you.
Yeah.
Leon says, about online atheists arguing with religious fundamentalists, there's a saying we have in Spanish that always comes to mind when I see it happen. It goes, the plate told the plan. What does that mean?
That goes over my head, yeah.
Yeah.
You're back.
Yeah, sorry. It's suddenly started happening a lot. I don't know if it's because I just knocked the computer with my leg. That might be what it is. I'm going to move this way slightly. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I don't know, it's not going to help. I will try and sort this out again. It worked perfectly fine the other day, though, didn't it? With Luke. So, yeah. Maybe Leon's right, and you have cast some spell whenever you're on stream.
That is a good explanation. I will grant that. That is likely.
Yeah, pretending to be an atheist.
Correlation is not causation.
Oh.
Not all the time, anyway.
I mean, it clearly is now.
So, yeah, were there any other stages to the arguments that you think we need to address, or do you think that sort of is where he got to his position? We should move on to addressing the behaviors of the online atheist community.
I mean, you could always go deeper into this stuff, but we're not that kind of podcast. But that basically covers what convinced him, why it convinced him, and a couple of places you can look to see rebuttals and things like that. So yeah, I think we're pretty good. And people can always ask us questions, and we could always address them.
Yeah,
like in a further stream or something.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I'm more than happy to do that. As we say with all of our videos, if you do have any questions about anything, you want us to go deeper on any of the topics, we're more than happy to do so. I think there's a lot that can be said, and we don't want to keep you here for hours and hours and hours and hours. So if there's specific things you want us to address in future streams or go deeper into, we can focus on that. Leon's come back and confirmed, saying basically it's talking about how one person, the plate, is critiquing someone else, the pan, who is similar to them. So yeah, I mean that sort of makes sense. Kettle. Yeah. The pot calling the kettle black. So that's what we'd say in English. Obviously, it's talking about one's on a flame, because both the pot and the kettle would have been, burnt by the flame, etc. Or they'd be cast iron, which again is why they're that color. It doesn't have that same ring to it in English. That's why we've got our own one. Haha. Rusty says, when I talk to a theist and they assert that I need God in my life, am I right asking for a burden of proof if they think that?
You ask them to justify why you need God in your life.
Yeah. They don't necessarily have to justify that God exists in that sense, but they do have to justify why it's a necessity, which would probably then end up them making a claim that God exists and wants you to do those things, at which point you're then right to say, okay, please justify that.
I mean, there is an argument that can be made that separates God from religion, and you can argue that religion helps people be better people and there's a better community and things like that. So you could argue that you need God in your life in the sense that you need a religion in your life. Without proving God, you can show the benefits of religion.
Mm-hmm.
At least I think so, anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think there are plenty of benefits to be had from religion, but I think equally you can show the downsides to religion as well. So if they come up with all these things of, look how good religion is, you could quite easily go, okay, no, I accept that there are those positives, but then look at all these negatives. And the fact that you've accepted that, if they don't accept that there are these negatives too, then they're sort of guilty of special pleading in that regard. Yeah, so it's not me touching it, so we know that much. I do apologize.
We can see that with the camera.
I really hope it isn't my sound card going. I really hope it isn't my sound card going, though. I'll just have to change my entire setup again. I suppose I could run everything back through this again, but then
or I can just leave. I mean that's another thing as well. But...
I'm sure it isn't actually you, Philip. So Rusty Nails asks what special pleading is. So it's essentially holding things to different standards. That is a really easy way to put it. So, for example, one I always come with is when a creationist talks about evolution, they talk about a changing kind. And the average atheist would say you need to learn the science of that sort of thing. Look into evolution a little bit deeper to what you've been told. And then they will go, well, atheism is only a lack of belief. And you might turn around and go, I think you need to look into a little bit more about that. There's there's a hell of a lot of philosophical material on it. There's lots of arguments against the existence of God and so on and so forth. No, I don't need to do that. It's only a lack of belief. Well, there's more than one definition. No. So what you're telling me is you're not going to look at the academic material for this thing, but you expect the theist to look at the scientific material on evolution, but you're not going to hold yourself to the same standard. And I'd say that's a form of special pleading. There's obviously the weak atheism special pleading argument as well, which is if atheism is only a lack of belief,